Mervyn, thank you so much for joining me on Facing the Canon.
It's a great pleasure, John.
And I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit of your story and what you do. You are the founder and the current CEO of Christian Solidarity Worldwide. What does that mean?
What does Christian Solidarity Worldwide mean? Or
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Christian Solidarity Worldwide is an advocacy organisation, and we speak up. Initially, we were set up to be a voice for persecuted Christians around the world, and still that is by far the bulk of what we do. But we also speak up for other faiths, people of other faiths who are persecuted. And we do that in Parliament, we do it at the United Nations, in Brussels, on Capitol Hill, and many places around the world. We raise awareness, we provide a voice. So Proverbs 31 talks about speaking up for those who are unable to speak for themselves. We use that as our mandate for providing a voice for people all over the world who are suffering because of their faith.
How many years have you been doing that?
Well, we set it up in 1979, so that's a long while, 36, 37 years.
And what prompted you to do this?
Well, I was quite interesting because I was involved in local politics. I was a local councillor in my early 20s, and which actually was quite a thing I come from a pretty strict Pentecostal background, and you didn't get involved in politics. Preaching the gospel was all about either knocking on doors or standing on street corners and preaching, which is great. But getting involved in the dirty world of politics wasn't done. But I did. And my church were pretty unhappy with me, actually. And the reason they gave was that I couldn't attend the prayer meeting on Wednesday nights because I had a council meeting. But I felt that was a real, I really felt that was a good thing to do. I believe that Christians should be salt and light in their community and in the nation. And so I felt very strongly about that. But it was through that, being a member of a political party, I was living in Essex, and I started to travel to London a couple of nights a week and work for a Catholic member of Parliament called David Atkinson. He was a member for Bournemouth, and he and I became friends, and he told me about a group that had come and spoken in Parliament from Switzerland, and they'd spoken about Christians being persecuted in Russia. Of course, in those days, that's all we heard about was persecution was the Eastern Bloc countries, the old, the behind the Iron Curtain. And so he said, I'd like to set something up in this country. Will you help me? And he knew I was a Christian. It was quite an interesting combination because he was a Catholic, I was Pentecostal. And the first MP that we got involved with us, John, was the Reverend Martin Smith, who was an Ulster Unionist MP, who at the time was president of the World Orange Order. So we had quite a breadth of churchmanship, you might say. We never discussed theology, otherwise CSW wouldn't be in existence today. But it's quite interesting because I can't honestly say that I immediately had a burden for Christians being persecuted in Eastern Europe. That burden wasn't there, but I sort of did it as a favour to David, who wanted to set something up in this country. So I said, yeah, okay. He said, will you chair the board? I said, yeah, I'll do that. And so we did. But I have to say, although I didn't have a burden, I very clearly, the day that I agreed that I would be part of setting up this organisation, driving home, I really felt the Lord show me exactly what CSW would become. And that was that this is the way that the Lord sort of put it in my mind, that it would be a sort of Christian version of Amnesty International. So an advocacy organisation, not an aid organisation, but just being a voice and raising awareness for people. So the Lord clearly showed me that, but the burden came later on.
So give us some facts.
Okay.
What's it like in the world at the moment? What kind of statistics have you got? Have you got
Yeah, the statistics are difficult to come by, to be honest with you, accurate statistics. There are statistics that are bandied around, but in CSW, one of the most important things that to us is that we are accurate in the things that we do. So anything that we say, anything you see on our website or read in our magazines, you can guarantee are accurate. So when it comes to statistics, we're a little bit reticent, but the sort of ballpark figure that people talk about is around is between 100 and 200 million Christians around the world who are overtly persecuted for their faith. The Pew Foundation in America have done some sort of wider work on religious freedom, which encompasses all faiths. And they say that 76, this is quite huge, 76% of the world's population, so over 3/4 of the world, live in countries with high or very high restrictions on religious freedom, which is quite staggering. I mean, we don't suffer from it in this country yet, although some people might well say that it's on the way and that it may have even started. But it is staggering, 3/4 of the world's population. And of course, what you've got to remember, and what we sort of find difficult in Western Europe, because Western Europe is about one of the only parts of the world where religion isn't that important. You know, we're so secular. But for the rest of the world, religion is one of the most important things in people's lives. It impacts the way they live, who they marry, where they work, what they do, everything. And so to us in Western Europe, religious freedom isn't quite as important as it is to most of the rest of the world.
So in some countries, when you talk about restrictions, would it be illegal to own a Bible?
Yeah, in some places it may be illegal to own a Bible. I mean, there are no laws anywhere that say that, unless, you know, maybe somewhere like North Korea, certainly if you had a Bible, you would be in big trouble.
But like, for example, in the Maldives, if you go there on holiday, you're told not to take a Bible.
Yes, yeah, the Maldives is a very, very strict Muslim country, and they really don't like Bibles in. But it's not, even then, it's not a law. The Bible is a book that is not well received in many parts of the world.
So what kind of, give us some examples of restrictions in certain countries?
Yeah, well, restrictions would vary, and it's not always you see restrictions from government, although there are restrictions, for example, in China, where where there is an official church, and unless you are part of the official church, you're not counted in any statistics for a start, but you are persecuted because you're not allowed to meet illegally. So that's something that's you're not officially allowed to meet, although generally speaking they would turn a blind eye. Although even that recently has gone backwards, and they're breaking up many church buildings that have been made. But although they're underground church, they still have buildings that they meet in. But in North Korea, for example, you can't use the name of Jesus or even talk about God in a place like North Korea. And
So what would happen then if somebody said that they follow Jesus?
Yeah, again, well, people rarely would say that in North Korea, and it's a very, very closed country, and of course, I'm sure when North Korea becomes free, and I do believe it will be, because we've been praying for many years, and just like when
Albania.
Albania is a great example, John, because they said that was the atheist country, wasn't it? And they said there's no Christians in Albania, but when it opened up, there were Christians
Was it at
everywhere.
one time considered the only atheistic state?
Yes, it was.
Yes.
That's right.
And then what happened to change that?
Well, when communism collapsed throughout Eastern Europe in the late 80s, early 90s, and so it was the government there was overthrown, and they found Christians all over, and I believe that will be the case in North Korea. But let me tell you a story about North Korea, because I met a lady in a hotel in South Korea a few years ago, and she told me her story, which was staggering. She told me that she had been travelling inside North Korea, obviously not a Christian, and she'd been on a railway station in a town far away from her home, and an elderly lady had come to her and started sharing the gospel with her. And now, two things about that. One is that lady was doing something very dangerous. By sharing the gospel, she was risking her own life.
Yeah, just talking
absolutely.
about Jesus.
So what should have happened was the lady who she was sharing it with should have immediately gone to the secret police and should have reported this lady. And she would have been almost certainly thrown into a prison camp. She could have even been executed. Nobody knows what happens in many executions in the prison camps amongst Christians and others. But she shared the gospel. This lady received the gospel and there on that railway station asked Jesus into her heart. Now, she went back to her home and she couldn't tell anybody. She couldn't even tell her husband or her family because in North Korea, I think it's every 8 houses in every street there is an informer, there is somebody that you have to report to. So her husband would have thought he was doing a duty to the state and would have reported her to this person. So she couldn't tell anybody. Now just roll on a couple of years to when I met her in South Korea. She'd escaped from North Korea by herself, and she pulled out of her bag in my hotel, she pulled out of her bag 2 exercise books with lots of writing that I couldn't understand. And she said, through an interpreter, she said, "This is the diary of my spiritual life inside North Korea." Now, my mind started working overtime, and I thought, well, how can you have...
I know. My mind's working overtime.
Yeah, I know. Think about it.
No church.
No church, no
worship,
pastor.
No Bible.
No UCB.
No.
Nothing.
Nothing.
No, nobody to teach her anything. Not even a hymn book or anything. So I'm thinking, how can you have a spiritual life? But I said to the interpreter, "Can you read me some of the stuff in here?" And she'd written about the grace of God. She'd written that there was scripture in there. There was things that she could never have had access to except by the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit
revealed it to her.
Absolutely, and discipled her. And I truly believe that when North Korea opens, there'll be people like that. Because, and I'm a great believer in being part of a church. I think it's really important to have fellowship and to all of those things. But, when that's impossible, the Holy Spirit gets to work, as it did in the case of that lady. Amazing
That's
story,
remarkable, absolutely, and hugely inspiring. Regarding persecution, so give us some examples of how some people are severely persecuted.
Yeah.
What kind of countries, what kind of people?
Okay. Let me tell you, let me tell you a story about Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka is, and very often the persecution doesn't only come from the government, or sometimes it doesn't come from the government, but actually comes from society. Okay. So in Sri Lanka, and very often the persecution, so it's violence against Christians coming from society, often driven by other faith groups. So in Sri Lanka, driven by Buddhists against Christians who don't like people becoming Christian. But what often happens in these countries that although there are no laws against this, the authorities turn a blind eye to the violence against the Christians. So in Sri Lanka, for an example, and this is an amazing story, and you'll love it because it's got an evangelistic touch to it. It's one day there was a Buddhist monk in his early 20s, and walking along a road in a solidly Buddhist part of southern Sri Lanka, not a Christian or a church in a 50-mile square mile area. As he was walking along the road, a car went by and a piece of paper fluttered out of the car. And he bent down and he picked it up, and that was a gospel tract. He read it, and again, without anybody guiding him, he came to know Jesus. So off he went to
just through reading
just
a pamphlet.
through reading the tract.
Yes.
He then went to, he wanted to know more about this, so he enrolled in an Assemblies of God Bible College in Colombo. Off he went to Bible college. He
as a Buddhist monk.
Well, yes, but I'm sure he took off his robes and told them that he was now a Christian.
Yes.
But I'm sure that his discipling really began actually in the Bible college. But while he was in Bible college, he met his wife, and after they graduated, he said to her, "I feel God's called me and us to that 50 square mile area where I became a Christian, where I grew up, where there's not a church, there's nothing there, there's no Christians." So she went with him. After, and this was about 1988, after a couple of years, so they went back, I think, in 86. After a couple of years, she, one evening, she was cooking dinner for her husband. They got a little boy by now, a little toddler, and suddenly, in through the front door burst a man with a gun. And in front of her and her little boy, he shot dead her husband. And as he wasn't completely dead, he took out a knife and he started stabbing him in the room where they were. And it was because this man's wife had given her heart to Jesus and had gone to his church. So this was obviously hugely traumatic.
Yes.
They had the funeral, and the cross on his name was Lionel Jasingi. The cross on Lionel's grave was the first cross ever seen in that 50 square mile area. Assemblies of God said to Lalani, his wife, and the little boy, come back to Colombo. We'll find you a nice place to stay. And she said, no. We were both called here. We were called to this area. That was 1988. Since then, Lalani has laboured faithfully in that place. She's built up a church. That church, when Lionel died, maybe 20, but there are now 300 plus in the church. She travels all around the 50 square mile area preaching, and has over 1,000 Christians in that 50 square miles. Her church has been bombed. She has been attacked. She's been shot at. She's been stoned. And not once in all of that she ever called the police. She tells the people that she's forgiven them. But she has laboured, and through her husband's martyrdom,
yes,
the church has grown. Now, when you drive into that town, the very first thing you see is the cross on their church, which can be seen for miles around. That's a story of how God works through persecution, of people who are determined that they are going to follow Jesus. That's Sri Lanka.
That's Sri Lanka.
Yeah. And of course, there are, and that's violent Buddhists, which in a sense we sort of think that's unusual. You don't think of Buddhists as being violent,
no,
but it happens.
It happens.
It happens.
What about in Islamic countries?
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan is a great example of great persecution against Christians. It would be virtually impossible to go to church in Pakistan without having to go through an armed guard on the doors because of bombings, because of people coming in and killing Christians, and of course they've got the notorious blasphemy laws in Pakistan, which many Christians have fallen foul of, and they're used, and not just against Christians, against Muslims too, but they're used as a means of settling disputes very often. You have an argument with your next door neighbour, and your next door neighbour will say, "Oh, you've just blasphemed the prophet," and you'll be put in prison. And the penalty for blaspheming the prophet or desecrating the Quran is death. Although nobody actually has ever been, they've been sentenced to death, but nobody's actually ever been executed in Pakistan for that. But the thing is, once you've been accused, that's it. Your life is over. Because you can be killed in prison by other prisoners. You can be killed in court, as has happened on more than one occasion, when you're going to court for the blasphemy case. Or if you manage to escape all of that and get out of prison and get released, then your family or the local society will come after you. So once you've been accused of blasphemy, it's very, very difficult. And we have managed to get out of Pakistan a number of people over the years who have been accused of blasphemy, and the only answer is to escape to another place. So, that's what it's like in places like Pakistan. Places like Egypt, which is an interesting country, which has got the largest Christian it's the largest Christian minority in the Middle East. Between 10 and 15% of Egyptians are Coptic Christians.
Yes.
Up until recently, Christians were not regarded as equal citizens with the rest of the population. And so
what would that mean in practice?
Well, it would mean in practice that things like there would be huge discrimination in employment, that you wouldn't be able to get promoted in a job. It would mean discrimination in education, and it would mean just generally you were a second-class citizen. And of course, similarly to what I was saying earlier, when there are attacks against Christians in the community, the authorities just turn a blind eye, or they'll arrest the Christians, as opposed if they feel that they've got to arrest somebody for for unrest or for a murder or something like that, they'll arrest the Christians who have not been responsible at all but who have been the victims. So
you're aware of, in your research through your organisation, of Christians being sent to prison because they're Christian.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. In many parts of the world, that's the case.
And they're left in prison.
Yeah.
For years.
Yes, sometimes. They're tortured very often in places like China, and of course this was really the case in the old Eastern Bloc countries. Where people were sent to prison and forgotten about, and very often died in prison after being tortured. But yes, there are still places where you are sent to prison for being a Christian, and I think...
What kind of countries would they be, Mervyn?
Can I just say, they would never say that they're putting you in prison because you're a Christian.
Yes.
Okay? There would be... And the latest thing in most of those countries, Iran is a country where there are Christians in prison. They're put in prison charged with crimes against the state, so treasonable type things. So because they are Christians, they're regarded as part of America or the UK, of the West. Whereas, of course, we all know that Christianity actually was birthed in the Middle East.
Of course.
It's not a Western religion at all. So they charged them with these crimes against the state. And in places like Iran, in places like Sudan, they are put in prison because of that, with those kind of charges. One of my dearest friends, who became a sort of spiritual father to me, was a Romanian Orthodox priest, and he was in prison for 21 years of his life, and
because of his faith.
Absolutely, yes, and I was privileged to help to get him out of prison. In fact, I was arrested trying to visit him when he was under house arrest himself in the late 80s or middle 80s, and but he had some amazing stories to tell. He told how he had been at one point in prison. He had been, I think it was 5 months. Oh no, for 15 months he'd been in solitary confinement, hadn't seen anybody. His wife hadn't been allowed to visit him, and saw nobody except his guards, who didn't speak to him.
Locked up,
yeah, and maybe allowed out once a day for half an hour, something like that. But totally solitary. Even his guards didn't talk to him. He didn't use his voice in 15 months. So much so that he told me that at the end of the 15 months, when he had 2 people put into his cell with him, he actually couldn't remember the language. It took him quite a while to get his vocabulary back, which is something that you and I can't really take in, can we? So, but these two men were put into his cell. What he didn't know was that they'd been put in there to kill him. So his case was known by us and by others, and we were publicising this. And so Ceausescu, who was the dictator in those days, sent these two men into the cell. They thought, well, they can kill him and it'll be a fight in prison. It's not the state's fault. It'll just be prisoners fighting. And Father Culture didn't know that. He was just so thrilled that he got two cellmates that he could actually commune with. But he soon found out that every single day they used to beat him, they tore his hair out, they made him eat his own excreta, they urinated on him, they did the most unmentionable things to him. But every day, he told me, he used to get down on his knees for an hour and pray. And he prayed the Orthodox liturgy, but he would pray. And he said it was during those hours that the shouting and the screaming and the kicking was at its very worst. But he did that every day for 5 months. At the end of the 5 months, he was on his knees praying one day, and as he was praying, he felt a strange... there was no kicking, there was no shouting, nothing. Silence in the cell. And he sort of quite wanted to open his eyes to see what was going on, but he didn't. He carried on and he prayed through the liturgy. And then he opened his eyes and he found these two men. One of them had killed his own mother, the other was a serial killer who killed 9 or 10 people. So they weren't nice people. They were kneeling either side of him, weeping. And he said, what's this about? You know, why are you like this? They confessed. They said, we were sent in with orders to kill you. We were told that we would be set free if we killed you. We have done our best to break you, but somehow we just couldn't kill you. But all you've done is love us. What's this about? We've never known, both of them said, we've never known love before. Father Couch said to them, well, you know, I have to confess, it's not my love, I can't love you, but it's the love of God shining through me.
Yes.
And he led them to Christ there on that prison cell. The next day they were taken, they were never seen again, almost certainly killed because they refused to kill Father Couch. But you know, many years later, and we got him freed and he went to live in America, Father Culture, and he had a little church there. And one year when I was at the prayer breakfast, like I was last week, he came and visited me in the hotel because he'd become a dear friend. He used to come to the UK and he used to stay in my parents' home, and he was a lovely, lovely man. And he said to me one day in Washington, Merv, he said, sometimes I wish I was back in my prison cell. I said, why? Why would you ever want to be back there after all the things? And he only told me a fraction of what went on. He wouldn't tell. He said, because, and these were the words he used, he said, because when I was there, I had no option but to throw myself off into the abyss of God's love. He said, and that sustained me. He upheld me. Now, he said, I'm in Washington. I don't have any need. I don't need God anymore. He didn't mean he didn't need God, but that's the way.
He didn't need to abandon himself.
No, exactly. Yeah. And so actually, he felt he was in a better place spiritually. And this is, you know, you never hear me use the term, and I'm not criticising people who do, because lots of people talk about the suffering church. I never talk about the suffering church, because they are suffering physically and emotionally, but spiritually, these people are not suffering at all. These people are living a victorious life in Christ that can only inspire us. They are suffering in my way, but I don't refer to them as suffering. I prefer to refer to them as the victorious church.
That's such a moving story. Tell us, Mervyn, what are you doing as an organisation, as a charity, to help people who are being persecuted?
Well, we, as I said right at the beginning, we're an advocacy organisation, so we provide a voice in the various political arenas that I've talked about.
So, for example, why is it that United Nations aren't doing anything? Are they aware of the situation?
Yeah, they are. So there is a special rapporteur for religious freedom. At the moment, it's a man called Heiner Bielefeld, and he is at the Human Rights Council. He's raising awareness about religious persecution across the world. Then we have worked very hard, for example, to get 2 commissions of inquiry into both Eritrea and North Korea. But
are those 2 of the worst countries?
Yes, they are. I would say yes, they are 2 of the very worst.
And would you add Nigeria to that?
Oh, absolutely. That's a different. Can I come back to Nigeria? Nigeria is a place that sadly gets not much press, but the situation for Christians in northern Nigeria is horrific. But just to come back to the UN.
Yes.
They set up a commission of inquiry, and we were pushing this for a long while. They set up a commission of inquiry to look at North Korea, crimes against humanity, and they met under an Australian judge who led the inquiry, and they took evidence from CSW and others, and they produced a report after just a year, which may be 18 months ago now. Which proved not just crimes against humanity in North Korea, but actually proved that Christians were a particular target in that country. We also got a commission of inquiry on Eritrea. You say, well, what difference has that? Well, I say anyway. What difference has that made on the ground in North Korea or in Eritrea? One of the things it does do is it gives hope to the people in the countries if they see that. In North Korea, they don't get an awful lot of news in from the outside. But if they hear that they're being talked about at the United Nations, it does give them some hope.
Sure.
And it's a step, it's a small step to the next, that the more that the world is aware, and until 7 or 8 years ago, when we produced our first report on North Korea, the world wasn't talking about human rights in North Korea. It was a state that nobody knew anything about. And so in itself, the fact that the world is now talking about what's happening in North Korea is a success, is a huge success for the work that we do. But it doesn't seem like a success because there are still people in prison camps and being executed.
So you're researching, you're reporting, you're raising awareness. How are you trying to get these people out of the prisons?
Okay, right. It's almost by doing all of the things that you've just said. So, but one of the, and this is where our church-facing work starts. So this is our, what I've just explained is our advocacy, parliamentary, political-facing work. But what we need is Christians in our churches and throughout the world to help us. So we ask for, the biggest thing that we do is pray. I don't think I could work for a non-Christian human rights organisation like and there are great organisations like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. They do great work, but the big difference with a Christian organisation is that we can bring these to the Lord in prayer. We can ask our supporters to pray, and prayer changes things.
So obviously, praying for our brothers and sisters who are being persecuted, praying for protection, and obviously if the father or the husband's in prison, there are consequences to the wife and the mother and the children.
Absolutely. We just recently, I was last week in America. I was talking to a Chinese lawyer and his wife, and who had been taken a number, and so many of these Christian lawyers they take on human rights cases because of their Christian motivation, and I was talking to his wife, and she was saying that they, after he came out, and very often these people are put in prison and their families are not even told where they are.
Sure.
That they just disappear. And for maybe months, sometimes years, they don't even know if they're alive. But her husband eventually was sort of set free from prison. She hadn't seen him, and then they were put under house arrest. Now, I don't know what you think house arrest is, but in this case, it meant that the guards, the Chinese authorities, slept in their house every night. Okay, so she had somebody sitting on a chair next to her bed, and after they had a girl who is now 10, but she was born into that house under house arrest, and for until she was 6 years old, she was never allowed out of the house. Can you imagine what that would mean to a little girl growing up, socially, never met another child, didn't know what another child looked like, hadn't had a conversation. And so it has huge impacts. And you know, so often you hear marriages even breaking down because of the separation and the intolerable burden that's been put on families. But praying for them, and I want to get back to that because prayer is really, really important. But that's
something we can all do.
I'm going to tell you 4 things that we can all do, okay? And they all begin with P, and it's very easy. Praying is so important. Protesting, because, you know, we should all raise our voices about this. If we remain silent, if we hear about these things that are going on and we remain silent, we are complicit in what's happening. We're saying, we know about this, but, you know, we're comfortable, thanks, we don't want to. So we need to protest, we need to raise our voice, we need to speak up for those who are unable to speak for themselves. So we can protest. How can we do that? Well, you know, we at CSW, you can go onto our website and you can get emails from us that will tell you, we'll make it very easy for you to be able to send an email to the authorities. We had a pastor in prison in Iran a few years ago, Pastor Nadakani, who was accused of apostasy, and he was on death row. And we got our supporters to email Iranian embassies around the world. And I think in just over a week, by putting this out on Twitter and Facebook, we had over 60,000 Christians around the world who sent emails. So much so that he was eventually released from prison. So protest can make a difference. Even speaking to our own MPs, getting them to raise these things in Parliament is really, really important. So we can pray, we can protest, we can provide. Be very nice. I like people when they provide for our organisation financially, but it's not just about that. It really isn't just about that. We can provide for people by we've got something called Connect and Encourage, which is an address book, and it allows people to write letters and cards to families like you're just talking about, of people, maybe their husband or their wife has been killed, maybe they're in prison, maybe they've disappeared or whatever. We can write to people in prison. And now those letters...
And do people get those letters?
Oh, most of the time, yes. Some they don't. But even if they don't, it makes a difference, because the authorities see, wow, this person is known about in the rest of the world. We can't just let them rot and die, because and most governments are sensitive about other people knowing what's going on in their prison cells and in their countries.
And have you spoken to people who've ended up receiving letters?
Oh, absolutely, many times.
Go on, give us an example.
I mean, just recently we had we took around this country a guy called Omar Guda Perez, who was a Cuban pastor. He was put in prison, and he told an amazing story where he was actually felt a complete failure. He was depressed, he was down, he was close to losing his faith. He told me this. I was close to losing my faith. He said, I felt that the fact that I was in there, I was a failure to God. I was of no use. And he said, and then my wife came to visit me. And he said, he said, in fact, he did start to tell her how he felt and how he was losing his faith in God. And she said, I just need to tell you, she said, I've got dozens and dozens of cards and letters that have just come from the UK, from people who are praying for you. and they know about your situation. And it completely turned him round. Those letters and cards brought him back to faith and brought him in a stronger position where he was able to witness in prison, and they made the difference. I'll tell you another story which is incredibly encouraging, but we had a lady that we put in our Connect and Encourage book, and her husband had disappeared. He was a pastor in Colombia, and he'd disappeared. Guerrillas had kidnapped him. She didn't know where he was. So we got people to write letters and cards. And when we visited her in her home, she pulled out a big shoebox that had got all these cards in. And she said, "Do you know what I do?" She said, "Every day I take one of these cards out and I pray for the person that sent it to me."
Oh my word, I want to send her a card.
And me.
Wow.
And me. So, you know.
So we can pray,
protest, provide, and we can proclaim. So we can speak out about this. Because, you know, you remember last year when the Charlie Hebdo shootings. And, you know, I don't know, in a dozen, 15 people, journalists were killed in Paris. Terrible thing, absolutely terrible. But the outcry was phenomenal. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the world. Millions of people came out on the streets. You remember?
Yes.
We are Charlie Hebdo, and je suis. And but in the same week, several hundred people were slaughtered in northern Nigeria.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a column inch on it.
No.
Nobody said a word. We need to be proclaiming this.
I know.
We need to be shouting it from the housetop. We need to be saying to people, hang on. Because these things that you and I have been sharing today, John,
I know.
People don't know about.
No, I know.
They don't make the headlines. My son came home from school a couple of years ago now, and he had to, for RE, he had to find 5 good news and 5 bad news stories on the news that were to do with religion. He easily found 5 bad things about religion, but couldn't find any good news stories, couldn't find things that were really important. They weren't there. The kind of stuff that our media so often focus on is trash.
Yeah.
But the really important stuff nobody's speaking about.
No.
We need to do that. We can do that in CSW. You can do it. You've got a powerful voice. I've got a powerful voice. But we need everybody to be doing it. We need the media to be focusing on these things. We need everybody to... I'm often... People say to me, you know, non-Christians, they say, "What do you do for a living then?" You know, and I tell them. I say, "Oh, I didn't know that kind of thing happened in the world."
Yeah.
You know, what's this all about? They just don't know.
No, there's an ignorance, isn't there?
It's our responsibility. Nobody else will do it. We have to.
How many countries in the world are you aware of persecution taking place?
It's a very difficult... I mean, we actually only work, as CSW, we only work in 26 countries, and that's mainly because we haven't got the resources, but there are at least double, maybe treble that amount of countries where there is overt persecution. We choose our 26. We look at countries and we think, where can we make the most difference? Which are the worst ones? But there is persecution of one kind or another, probably somewhere between 50 and 100 countries of the world.
Yeah. Now, obviously, you're very much aware of what's happening in the 26 countries that you're working in. And do you sometimes get overwhelmed and feel discouraged and depressed?
I can honestly say that the answer to that is no. This is a question I get asked all the time. I sometimes wish I could do more. In fact, I often wish I could do more. And I will, you know, I'm sure my dream is that, you know, one day I will be able to provide a voice for every single persecuted Christian and others, and we do speak up for other injustice
and
too.
That's your kind of motto, isn't it? A voice for the voiceless.
Voice for the voiceless. So I dream of the day when we'll be able to... There won't be one Christian in the world that can actually say, nobody heard my voice, nobody knew what was happening. That's my dream, you know. And I think, you know, we are seeing success. There have been more debates in our British Parliament, in both houses, on the persecution of Christians and persecution generally, religious freedom. There have been more debates on those topics in the last 2 to 3 years than I have known in the 37 years that I've been doing this. There's so much awareness now. There's an all-party parliamentary group on religious freedom which is talking about these things. So, that in itself is a success, but we've got to see change on the ground.
If you had to quote a verse from the Bible that undergirds what you do, which book of the Bible would you turn to?
You can't pin me down on one. I got 3 really.
Go on then.
One is the one that I've already quoted a couple of times tonight from Proverbs 31 that says that we are to speak up for those who are unable to speak for themselves. That is a clear mandate. And can I say, John, that includes non-Christians too. And I do want to say this is important because in the Old Testament, it talks very much about us looking after the stranger and the alien, people who don't believe the same that we believe. But God is a God of justice, and we must speak out against all injustice. And so we do that, and without fear or favour. If there are other faith groups that are persecuted, we speak out for them. It doesn't make me a syncretist. It doesn't make CSW a syncretistic organisation. I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father, and that's what motivates me in what I do. But we must speak up for all of those who have got no voice. The second one is, it says in Hebrews 13 verse 3, it says, remember those in prison as if you were in prison with them. And then the other verse from 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 26, and it says that we're all part of the body of Christ. When one part suffers, we all suffer. It also says when one part is honoured, we all rejoice. We don't find that bit too difficult to do. It's the first bit we find more difficult.
Mervyn, you truly are an inspiration. Your perseverance and faithfulness and what you've shared in the stories are just heartwarming. And thank you. Thank you for educating us a little bit more and remind us of those 4 P's: prayer,
pray, protest, provision and proclamation.
Well, my prayer and my hope is that we here in this live interview and the hundreds of thousands who will watch this interview will respond to those P's in some way. Thank you very much, Mervyn Thomas.